as most of them did. You know, even in the case of the Rosenbergs, they were offered a deal if they would come clean. And as someone wrote, he chose communism over his family, over his children. So it was a faith that was as, I guess, persuasive as medieval religion. So anyhow, it was a, in England, there was a ring. You probably know some of this. I'm going to try to skip over it so I can get to the United States. But in England, you probably have heard of Kim Philby. You all know the Cambridge Five? Okay. The Third Man, or I'll try to make it a little shorter. He worked as an undercover agent for the Russians while rising to the very top of British intelligence. He became the head of MI5. So he ended up in Moscow. He fled before he could be unmasked in England, ended up living in Moscow. He's a very interesting individual. He's written a book about his life and times as well. He was a supreme master of the craft. Born in India, his father was an intelligence officer in the India Civil Service, converted to Islam, settled in Saudi Arabia. This is the father. Took additional wives while he lived in Islam. He was a father was a hater of the British establishment. How far could you go from the establishment? Then taking converting to Islam and taking 5 wives. He also had a slave girl named I don't know how to pronounce her, Anyhow, he was a hater of the establishment and all it stood for. And apparently the son inherited this from the father. His name was not Kim. That was his nickname. He was named Kim after Kipling's hero. Kim, you know, the Kipling novel Kim. Kim was also, you know, in the novel, Kim is an undercover spy. So it's interesting that that preceded his exploits. Conventional upper-class education at Cambridge, joined the University Socialist Club at Cambridge. In 1931, the Labour Party was badly defeated, and Kim lost all faith in, I guess, the British electoral system. The parliamentary democracy had failed in 1931. He was converted immediately to communism. He said he was inspired by the impoverishment of working classes during the Great Depression. Capitalism was in collapse. I left the university, he said, in 1933 with a degree and with the conviction that my life must be devoted to communism. At Cambridge, he was a member of a group known as the Apostles. And they were a group of very privileged young men from the upper classes, many of them very hard drinkers, and a large number homosexual. The members of the Apostles at Cambridge included Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, both of whom would go on to a career in espionage and end in exile in Moscow. Anthony Blunt, who was again an agent, and who became, I think, director of the Queen's Portrait Gallery, something like that. So it was a group that from early on, 1931, had seen the collapse of capitalism, the depression in England, and apparently converted in one way or another to socialism. In 1932, Kim took a trip to the continent and must have been in touch with Comintern agents. That's the Communist International. In the summer of 1933, he was already working as a courier for the Comintern. In 1934, he was in Austria when there was an attempted coup by Nazis against the government. and he was almost ready to be arrested when his wife, who was an outspoken communist, persuaded him that he had to become a full-time Soviet agent. And so he did. In 1934, he was contacted by Soviet military officers and instructed to not only become an agent, but to publicly renounce communism and penetrate the British establishment. So he would become an undercover agent. He was also told to join all the pro-Hitler organizations in England. There was an Anglo-German fellowship in England. Join it. It's like Sorge, join the Nazi Party. That was the best kind of cover you could have. Well, he became a reporter. In 1937, he covered the Spanish Civil War for the London Times, all the while reporting back. During World War, in 1939, he was still working as a foreign correspondent for the Times of London, but at the same time, he had joined British intelligence. They were very anxious to enlist young men from good families who had good education and lots of social contacts. He became a member of SIS, Secret Intelligence Service, in 1939. And apparently he was checked over by British intelligence, and nothing recorded against him. They looked for, connections, didn't find a thing with him. So in 1940, he was working for British intelligence. In 1941, counterintelligence. He had full access to all the records. He knew exactly who in the Soviet Union was an agent for the British. He knew all their agents. He knew their names. That's beginning in 1941, right through for the next 10 or 15 years. Every British agent at work in the Soviet Union was liquidated in 1941 and 1942. He began to suffer doubts when Stalin made a pact with Hitler, but he said, my doubts were resolved by the German invasion. In 1943 and 1944, they put him in charge of a special unit that was to counter the communist threat. They were beginning to get worried about a communist spying operation, so they put him in charge. The Soviet contact told him he must do everything to get the top job. He got the top job, and he was sent to America, the British Embassy. He was in charge of counter-espionage, stationed at the British Embassy in Washington. The chief told him to have no contact with U.S. intelligence agencies because the Americans were leaking to the Soviets. The British were worried that the Americans were leaking, so they told him, have no contact with American intelligence. They're leaking. And here he is, the top spy in England. His reply was, in his book, it was a piquant situation. Well, here he was. He had access to everything. He had access to every Soviet defector. They were usually assassinated. And when the war ended, he was still in charge of one branch of intelligence. He traveled to France, Germany, Italy, Greece, and passed everything on to the Russians. They were always tipped off in advance of the penetration of any agent. Usually they'd be killed off. Any defector was done in and killed off. So I say he was in Washington from 1944 to 1945, knew all about the Manhattan Project to produce the atom bomb. FBI investigators knew there was a mole in the British Embassy. They started to investigate, but they didn't investigate him because, after all, the head of the agency can't be the spy. It has to be someone else. Meanwhile, the British intelligence was getting close to a couple of his friends, McLean and Burgess. They were both part of the ring at Cambridge, and they were getting close. He informed them that they were in danger, and they both fled to Moscow, lived out the rest of their lives in Moscow. Well, he came under suspicion because he had recruited them. So he was now interrogated. This is in 1945. He was interrogated. They brought some evidence against him, talked his way out of it. Eden, this prime minister, was asked in Parliament if Philby was the third man who had tipped off the others. This is Anthony Eden talking about the top spy in England, who's been at it now for 10 years. While in government service, he carried out his duties ably and conscientiously, and I have no reason to conclude that Mr. Philby has at any time betrayed the interests of his country, or to identify him with the so-called third man, if indeed there was one. Well, if that was at the top of the British government, how did we win the Cold War? It's quite a question. Well, having been vindicated, he went back to journalism, continued to work undercover, also had contacts in intelligence, and continued to spill the beans to the Russians. In 1963, apparently he became concerned about his status. There was apparently more investigations going on, and a Russian defector named Anatoly Golitsyn defected to the CIA in Helsinki. He spilled the beans on Philby. He said, we have an agent in England. He's been the top spy for 15 years. Well, when the defector confirmed it, they began to investigate. And Philby presumed they were getting hot on his trail. He was in Beirut covering for the newspaper, and he decided to get on a Soviet ship and go to Russia. So after 7 years, I left Beirut and turned up in the USSR. Why? Maybe I was tipped off. Maybe someone blundered. Maybe I was just tired. 30 years in the underground is a long stretch, and I cannot pretend that they left no mark. So he now arrived in Moscow, great honors. They gave him the Order of Lenin, the Order of the Red Banner. They put his face on a postage stamp. While in Moscow, he smoked, he drank. He had 3 or 4 wives, married, divorced. In 1988, he finally succumbed. Was given a funeral, a hero's funeral by the KGB. Wrote his memoirs. The book is called My Silent War. It's available, 1967. He said he had a commitment to a world made better through communism, and he never faltered. It cannot be very surprising that I adopted a communist viewpoint in the 30s. So many of my contemporaries made the same choice. But many of those who made that choice in those days changed sides when some of the worst features of Stalinism became apparent. I stayed the course. This is John le Carré, reviewed his book. He's the great spy writer. Philby has no home, no women, no faith. He had 5 wives. I don't know why I said that. Behind the inbred upper-class arrogance, the taste for adventure, lies the self-hate of a vain misfit, for whom nothing will ever be worthy of his loyalty. In the last instance, Philby is driven by the incurable drug of deceit itself. Some people were not so harsh. Graham Greene, also a great writer. He betrayed his country. Yes, perhaps he did, but who among us has not committed treason to something or someone more important than country? In Philby's eyes, he was working for a shape of things to come, from which his country would benefit. That's the introduction to Philby. So, why didn't the Russians take more advantage, make more of the spies of the Cambridge Five and so on? The Russians never quite, appreciated the value of it. It was too good to be true. How could our agent be in charge of British? The Russians couldn't believe it. We better take all his information with a grain of salt, because after all, this information, had to be confirmed by a second source, and sometimes it wasn't. Well, this is a story that I guess they always wondered if maybe he was a double agent and that he was trying to penetrate the NKVD. Well, this is one of the most famous spies to come out of World War I and the Cold War. The Cold War, you know, is the beginning of the Cold War, even before 45, the end. In 43, the American government began to get very suspicious of Soviet activity going on in the country. And they then began to exert additional controls because the Cold War, as I say, it was the apogee of espionage in the United States. And it was a war that was fought through espionage, through sabotage. It was not a traditional war. We never came to actual war. And why was that? This is the curator of the International Spy Museum in Washington. The apogee of espionage was the Cold War. The U.S. and the USSR had no intention of destroying all life on Earth, so the likelihood of an all-out war was very low. However, neither side was willing to cede an inch to the other, so the fighting was done through intelligence agencies. Even as early as 1941, a State Department said this: ample evidence exists that American communists are taking advantage of the present situation to attempt to ingratiate themselves in high government circles as advocates of democracy under the guise of advocating all-out aid to the USSR. The Cold War, the penetration of various branches of the U.S. government, the stealing of the bomb secret, and the transmission of other technology, just as, you know, in many ways as valuable, is a feature of this war. And it's all waged through through espionage, through the red infiltration of the higher levels of government, along with the attempt to steal American technology, including the atom bomb. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the appeal of communism in the United States. It's very similar to what I've already said. It was very appealing. The Bolshevik Revolution had swept away a lot of czardom's penalties and tyrannies, and the nature of Stalin's rule was really not entirely known. The great purges, the millions sent to Siberia, the millions dead in the collectivization of agriculture in the USSR. It was not entirely apprehended, and it was the idea of a redistribution of wealth and power in a more equitable manner was also very appealing. The USSR was seen during the war as an ally, of course, against Nazism that had stood up alone until December 41. So the appeal of communism was was at its greatest point, I guess, in history. And apparently, many people didn't become spies. They joined the Communist Party, but a small number of those who joined did, in fact, work for the Soviet Union. Has anyone here ever heard of a project called Venona? Okay, nobody. This is in many ways an American version of Bletchley Park. In 1943, American government officials became aware that there was some degree of spying in behalf of an ally, the Russians, going on. They were in possession of tons of Soviet decrypts, messages, but they couldn't decrypt them. They had messages that would explain a lot of Russian policy, but it wasn't top of the line. The war was going on. It was only 1943. It hadn't been decided. So they avoided, they tried to decrypt it. They set up a building in Arlington, Virginia. And they recruited a lot of young women that were very good in math and set them the job of decrypting these messages that were coming through from the Soviet embassy. In 1945, there was a very critical, crucial defection. A clerk in the Ottawa embassy of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, Canada, was ordered back to Russia. It was 45, the war was over. He didn't want to go. He wanted to stay in Canada. Can't blame him for that. So he decided to defect. And he would not only defect, but he would bring with him codes and ciphers and documents. His name was Guzenko. It was maybe the most important defection to, he went to the Ottawa Journal, and Guzenko said to the editor, "It's war." The editor said, "That didn't ring a bell with me because World War II was over and we were not at war with Russia." Nevertheless, Guzenko persisted. "You're not at war with Russia, but they're at war with you." Brought him the codes. Army intelligence had failed. It was Army signal intelligence, had had no success. But when the documents were transferred by the Canadians to the FBI, they were totally shocking because they provided a key to Russian espionage that had been going on through the war and into the post-war, including the espionage at Los Alamos. Now, there had been indications of penetration of the government and of agencies like the Atomic Bomb Agency for a while. There had been several defections from communist organizations. The most famous was Whittaker Chambers. You probably have heard the name. He had joined the party in 1925 and was part of the underground apparatus. He had worked as he was used as a courier, very prominent in the party. In 1938, he became very disillusioned by what was happening. He was in Russia, and especially the purges and the terror. So he decided to leave the party. And he not only left the party in 39, but he also began to speak about what he knew. But most people discounted it. It was 39, 40. He said that there is an agent in the highest reaches of the State Department who I collaborate with, Alger Hiss. I collaborate with Hiss. He's a member of the party. He is an underground agent. He is directly supplying the Soviet spy groups, NKVD, with first-hand information. Well, this didn't really make much of a splash in 1939. He had become editor of Time magazine, and he feared for his life. So he buried a lot of the papers that he had in his possession that proved that Hiss was his collaborator in the communist movement. He buried them in you remember the famous pumpkin papers. I don't know if you remember them or not, but anyhow. Well, in 48, he testified before the House Un-American Affairs Committee, and he identified a number of officials as members of the communist underground. There were denials. He was crazy, and this had never happened, and he was apparently Hiss sued him for, I think he sued him for perjury, treason, excuse me. He claimed that it was all made up, that he didn't know him, and that he must have a grudge against him. Well, it turned out in the long run that, well, let me stop right there. Let me go back to Benona. when the defection occurred, Guzenko's defection in Canada, suddenly they had the keys to the codes. They could read all of this information. They kept reading from 1945 to approximately 1951 or 52, when the Russians became aware of the breach and changed their codes. They amassed great piles of information. None of it was revealed to the public because the Russians would immediately change the codes, so they could not reveal it. Nevertheless, this project is one of the most important in the post-war era because it named people, places, information. It indicated that the Russian aim was first the atom bomb, of course, and a leak through Ultra actually tracked Klaus Fuchs, the Englishman, the English scientist who was at work in Los Alamos. He was arrested by the British Secret Service in London and given a 14-year prison term for spying for the Russians. He said that there was an American component to the ring and that he had been apparently contacted by an agent named Raymond. He didn't know who Raymond was, but he heard the word Philadelphia mentioned and gold, something like that. Well, Gold was the courier. They tracked Gold, who said the information he had came from somebody named Greenglass, who worked at Los Alamos. They now tracked down Greenglass, and he implicated his sister and her husband, the Rosenbergs. So this was the way in which they broke the ring. And they confirmed that the Venona paper, the Venona code breakers were working all this time. And all of it was confirmed, but it was not released to the public. So they had absolute confirmation, but it was not released. Nobody knew about Venona, including the president. It was such a secret project. It wasn't opened up to the public until 1995. Senator Moynihan said 50 years after the project began, 1995, they finally opened up the archive at Venona. And they suddenly discovered that the accusations were correct, that these people were communist spies, that Hiss not only was a communist spy for years and years, he had an alias, ALES. He and Chambers had sued. He had sued Chambers on the ground of perjury and had been found guilty because Chambers produced letters that were typed on a typewriter in Hiss's home. They were great contrasts because Hiss was every inch a patrician, had gone to Johns Hopkins and Harvard, had moved in the highest echelons of the State Department, had been an advisor to Roosevelt at Yalta, had been an official at the creation of the UN. He had been at the very highest echelons of the American government. There were others also scattered throughout the government in the State Department, the Treasury Department, and so on, that were not spying, but they were advocating Russian positions. And of course, the most famous of all, the Rosenbergs. Well, all of this is confirmed by by this archive, the Venona archive. So a lot of books have really, in a sense, had to be rewritten because all of this proof now has emerged that yes, Hiss was a spy, and yes, Harry Dexter White was a spy in the Treasury Department, and it goes on and on. They estimate about 350 had penetrated the upper echelons of the administration. But the confirmation came from this material that, and you know, it becomes a kind of an emotional thing also with the Rosenberg trial, which was so controversial, of course, and I guess the verdict of death, especially on Ethel who was apparently just typing material, was not directly engaged in the spying. There was hope that a death penalty would lead them to talk, that they would say something about, fess up about what had been going on. But as the judge said at the trial, Rosenberg had the choice between his communist faith and his children, and he chose his communist faith. It's just extraordinary period. But it's interesting that this espionage went on, and now they have confirmation through these papers. There are a number of books that have come out citing these papers. Like this one.
That's a big book.
It's the Venona Secrets. It gives you all the background of it. What's the book? This is by Romerstein and Brian Bell. Alger Hiss, very interesting book, Why He Chose Treason. And it's interesting, too, that there was another book that was written, a man named Alan Weinstein, a very well-known writer. He decided he would investigate the Hiss case again, because it was such a controversial case. So he started a book and he investigated, he interviewed Hiss, who had gone to jail for perjury, but released after 5 or 6 years. And he started off thinking that he was a victim of the Red Scare, of mass hysteria. But when he got well into the book, he concluded that Hiss had been a Russian agent, and that the verdict was in fact sound, and that having to admit that the Red Baiters may have been right was more than some people could stand. But a lot of material, the book, Weinstein's book is called Perjury, and started off thinking that this was a case of malfeasance of justice, and ended up concluding that in fact he was guilty as charged. I'm sorry I have to abbreviate a lot of this, but I think it gives you some idea of the war between the Russians and the West in the Cold War era, which ended only with the fall of communism in 1991. And what is so interesting, I think, is that there was an interview with the Russian president. This is right before Putin. And what Medvedev said, he's a Russian president, the Soviet Union was a very complex state. This is the president of Russia in 1991. And the regime that emerged can only be described as totalitarian. Unfortunately, this was a regime that suppressed basic rights and freedoms, not only of its own people, but of those who came home as victors after the war, only to be sent to labor camps. This is something we cannot erase from history. So our people won the Great Patriotic War, not Stalin. Stalin committed a vast array of crimes against his own people. So despite the fact that he worked hard, despite the fact that under his leadership the country flourished in certain respects, what was done to our own people cannot be forgiven. That is the first thing. So I think we'll have to leave it at that.